Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back home from the Race to World First, and I wanted to take the time to talk about the players for the race. Now, I've rated up to World 12th in level. I haven't rated in the World First, as you might know, with like Liquid and Echo, but I've played with a lot of the players from his guilds, and after casting the Race to World First multiple times, I wanted to talk a little bit behind the scenes for what makes these players different, what makes these players elite, and how they more or less got there. I think one of the biggest things that happens is that everyone focuses very heavily on the specific big plays that will define somebody and make them elite. Now, this partially can be true, but I think there's a lot of times where people sort of overly fixate on that. While it's amazing to see the incredible flashy plays that I Fired Up will put together on something like Zymox, and he had a couple really good ones for his own gameplay for things like Sarkareth, as well as Neltharion in particular, there's a lot of times where those sort of heroes of the raid are not going to be the ones that are making a flashy play that gets clipped. In fact, a lot of times what you'll be able to see is that some of the best players that raid leaders really love are the ones who are quiet and are very consistently using every ounce of utility or surviving longer than other people usually would, or are really just in control of what their job is and what their role is, and then how to be able to make a quiet play, make a quiet fix to somebody else's mistake if they really need to. One of the things you see in the Race to World First is progression on bosses that have tight damage checks. Echo of Neltharion, for example, you need to push into Phase 2 before you run out of space. And even into the final phase, you'll consume all of the portals and then you run out of space or something along those lines. This is a really good example of where players do great work focusing on their mechanics from the very beginning. And then later on, they can worry about how they're going to eke out the extra damage, how they can play greedier, or how they can adjust their positioning so they're DPSing right until they have to run out of the raid with Volcanic Heart or something along those lines. Those things just naturally are going to take time, but they put such a high emphasis from the very beginning on surviving, and this is probably one of the best examples of it. There's also the other example for like cooldown management, which can happen. We noticed it a lot with Razageth, and that was a very clear example where you had a damage buff, but you didn't use damage cooldowns, or not all of them, because you wanted to have more of a boss burn later on into the encounter, and you needed the cooldowns to do so. So there's a couple different ways that missing damage when you watch the Race to World First can sort of manifest with people using cooldowns in different ways to be able to get further into a fight, or of course just taking extra time to focus on the mechanics first. And I think this is something that's very underappreciated or under-noticed, I'd say, in the Race to World First. One of the biggest things that I think is under-talked about is the mindset of raiders, because it's very difficult to get a bunch of gamers to really talk about how they feel. But I can tell you from my own experience of raiding, 12, 14 hours a day, whether it was with Imperative or some of the day raids I did with Future back in the day, it is insanely grindy and repetitive, particularly when you have to do days on days of splits, as we saw in the recent race here in Aberrus. But for every race, there are these just grind moments where you're just sitting there doing islands, you're sitting there killing the same boss over and over again to try to go for this trinket, and it's very easy for your mind to like go to mush, or for you to shut down, and trying to be on and trying to be aware and trying to be focused for that many hours in every single day is just frankly exhausting. It's a very high mental strain that gets put onto people, and it gets a lot harder when, just like any other sport, if somebody makes a mistake, that could harm everybody else along the way. And so being able to sort of separate yourself from that like emotion of, oh, somebody made a mistake and oh, they gummed up progress for everybody else, but realizing and understanding that like, hey, mistakes happen. And sometimes you need to give up damage or give up healing to make up for somebody else's mistake so that the raid is going to be able to be successful. And I think that's one of the biggest areas that I've seen just from 10 years of raiding, of being able to see the players that are willing to be able to make those selfless plays, who are willing to help others and not sort of like lash out or jump out or anything. But it also takes that patience, but it also takes that sort of humility to ask for help and ask for assistance and then be able to give it to others when they also need it. A lot of times you're going to have very well-known players over the years who are just the rogue player, the boomkin player, the mage, the whatever, right? And sometimes you are going to have like 3 or 4 mage tiers, or well, 3 mage tiers or 3 warlock tiers. And sometimes you're bringing in somebody who is not that 100% main all the time. And having that second or third mage or warlock, for example, going to fire it up to ask for help, going to Splat, going to THD, whoever, to be able to ask for help and figure out what that little thing is that's required to be able to get to the next level makes all the difference in the world when it comes to how tight these races really can be. And I think that's one thing for a lot of people who want to constantly be improving themselves, is that there's a number of moments where you do have to ask for help and you do have to sort of ask for assistance to be able to figure out what it is that you're sort of missing. Because you can get really far in World of Warcraft by just learning what you need to be able to improve upon, but then sometimes it takes a bit of an outside perspective to be able to find out how to be able to help. That also is reflected in like weak aura packages, where players are receiving extra alerts or extra customization to their alerts to be able to wake them up and alert them to a specific mechanic that might be a struggle for them, that might be a pain for them. We saw it notably on Razageth as well, with like personal defenses being utilized in like phase 1 and how they'd space them out to be able to survive, depending on if they got a bomb, depending on if they were getting external dropped onto them or if they had something themselves. A lot of those things can be insanely difficult to be able to grind through for 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, hundreds of pulls onto a boss, and being able to ask for help and then figure out how your brain is actually going to work to help you goes an extremely long way. Experience is probably one of the biggest things and most challenging things. Sometimes you'll find players who kind of come out of nowhere and other teams have seen like promise in them, or they've been really impressed by them, and they kind of get called projects. In the guilds that I've been in over the years, where you see a player who has the potential to be able to improve, who has the potential to be able to be this elite raider, and I've seen very mixed results, of course, when it comes to projects, but the like most common denominator is always on that person and their desire to be able to improve. I remember I was having a watch party with like Gingy, Max, Storky, Growl, and one of the things Gingy said was that it was a lot about people's desire to improve and their willingness to put forth the effort to be able to improve themselves. And so a lot of times, you know, elite guilds will pick up people as a project or as trial, and then they'll invest that time to see if they're willing to improve themselves, if they have what it takes to be able to take the time, be patient, and consistently grind away to be able to improve. And one of the best ways that players are tested really is through splits on farm. Splits on farm usually just kind of feels like a very boring sort of activity to be doing, and a lot of times it can be. But from my own experience, especially when I was doing 4 splits a week, getting ready for an next raid tier, and I was playing not only my priest, but I was playing shaman, pally, and monk as well. Let's just say that my skill level with all of those other healers was not equal to my skill level with priest. Notably, for a number of years, I think I've played shaman in raids when I was playing in hardcore guilds for about 4 or 5 years. And shaman was always kind of my worst healer in raids. It was always one that I was just like not as comfortable with. And there's times where you really need to invest if you're, you know, not the disc priest. You need to invest in like 2 or 3 different healers to be flexible when you need to. Sometimes you just need to be good enough to be able to play that thing through heroic, get a good enough result, and then, you know, you don't have to worry about it from there. But I think a lot of times for players that are not in that sort of luxury, where the spec that they play is almost always brought to the raid, you need to be able to diversify what you're good at. And a lot of times, while it's no substitute for obvious race to world first progression, when you have splits going on and you do have players that are not as familiar with those specs, like me on my Resto Shaman, you'll have a lot of times where you do need to sweat it up and you do need to actually do everything possible to survive, even if it is just a regular old re-clear, because you're going to have lower eye level, lower experience, and you'll find that even in that sort of mindset, you do need to make sure you're optimizing how you're using defensives. You do need to make sure that, you know, you're kind of keeping a level head and keeping your focus for, you know, 4 or 5 hours plus as you're grinding through multiple splits of Mythic to be able to get everybody geared, get everybody where they need to be, and prepare for the next raid tier. I think I talked to Zyronic about this back when I raided with Future, and then he went back to raid with Limit or Liquid, and he talked about kind of like getting everybody back in shape. They sort of took a farm period where they went very, very light, and then the 2 months or something before raid tier started, they went back to doing really heavy amounts of splits. And that's what I saw for Liquid with Vault of the Incarnates, is that when I got there, they were like, oh yeah, we still have split 7 or 8 or something like that of Vault of the Incarnates to finish up before we get ourselves ready for the Aberrus race. And I think that's about as close as you can get to training and preparing players, because you do need to be able to play and you do need to give it your all on these instances. And if you've ever played in like a cutting edge guild that's cleared the raid and then you go into a farm cycle for a couple of months before the new tier drops, you'll find that people get pretty damn lazy. You'll even see it if you're in an AOTC guild and everyone's kind of re-clearing farm, where people can get pretty lazy. But when you're in these sort of splits format, you don't have that sort of luxury. And so as a result, it's a really good way to start bringing in new people and bringing in projects or trials to be able to start kind of testing their mettle as they go through. I think over the years, I've seen a number of different players who have had the time, that sort of patience, and that sort of focus to really put forth the effort to improve themselves. And sometimes it honestly just takes a long time to be able to find that right environment. I think JPC was a really good example, because when I first met him, it was like Shadowlands beta, and he was grinding M+ like crazy on his rogue and doing everything he could possibly do to improve himself, forming the groups. Even before he was a streamer, you know, I was like looking at groups and trying to get in and make sure I was doing content in Shadowlands beta, and he was always on, always looking to play, always looking for people to work with. And it went for him not only learning the dungeons, but also how to be able to improve himself in a PvE format, and he applied the same thing to raiding, and now look at where he's at. The last part of it, and we talked about this a bit on the Race to World First broadcast, is that when you're getting into larger guilds, you have a lot more infrastructure to be able to draw upon that takes a lot of like the responsibility out of the hands of players. And what I mean by that is, like, when it comes to like weak aura prep, when it comes to like some of the cooldown management, you might be very used to, if you're say a healer, having to work through the raid cooldowns yourself, having to work through the cooldown sheets yourself. And then these higher end guilds have the analyst crew, they have the teams. When I raided with Imperative for 3 tiers, we always had an analyst who was looking at the other World First guilds. We would try to mirror one of their compositions that fit best with the players that we had on the roster. And then our analyst would already have the cooldown sheet copied, ready to go, based off what Echo or Liquid was doing, depending on what fit us best. In fact, sometimes our analyst, she would have like 3 guilds, and we would kind of pick and choose what worked best for our team and what we were working on. And that makes people a lot more of specialists, where they have to be going in and then just perform and then just be able to execute. And so a lot of times when I did actually have free time, I wouldn't really focus too much on the overall fight itself for my own prep. I would specifically just focus on watching what the healers were doing in these guilds, watching when they were using cooldowns, and also how they were positioning themselves. You would see it on like Echo of Neltharian's POV, when like Nick, for example, was waiting to be able to go through some of the portals, and as they were crossing from one side of the room to the next, he would sort of cheat to a very specific area, so that way he would be able to take the Warlock Gateway and move, or stay behind, drop off his Volcanic Heart, and then go through the breach to be able to catch back up with the group before the pillars closed around him. Those kind of things make all the difference in the world when you prep for the fights, and watching the specific movement of how some of these people are surviving, so that you're not going to be the cause of some early deaths or some early mistakes that sort of impede progress. I could probably go wax on to this forever and ever, I'm sure. But I wanted to give a couple quick thoughts on what has made these World First players so good and how they actually got there. So if you have any other questions or any other topics like this you'd like me to dive into in the future, be sure to let me know down in the description below. And of course, huge thank you to our lovely patrons who make all this content possible. If you'd like to check it out, make sure you check it out in the description down below and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.